Most people imagine that philosophy consists in delivering discourses from the heights of a chair, and in giving classes based on texts. But what these people utterly miss is the uninterrupted philosophy which we see being practiced every day. Socrates did not set up grandstands for his audience and did not sit upon a professorial chair. He had no fixed timetable for talking or walking with his friends. Rather, he did philosophy sometimes by joking with them, or by drinking or going to war or to the market with them, and finally by going to prison and drinking poison. He was the first to show that at all times and in every place, in everything that happens to us, daily life gives us the opportunity to do philosophy. Plutarch 46-120. Walker, what I think we're doing in these letters is philosophy. It's hard work to take an honest and searching look at our lives. It always has been, and people have always resisted it. Let's remember that our kind of philosophy involves deliberately making ourselves uncomfortable. It's exercise for the mind and spirit. Think of what Socrates asked his fellow citizens to do: examine your lives. Take a disciplined look at your actions. Test your beliefs. Ask the hard questions. Discover how much you don't know. Socrates was a wily guy. Sometimes his questions were a bit unfair, sometimes he twisted people's words. But he never held a knife to anyone's throat, he never demanded that anyone ask the hard questions. The people of Athens could have chosen to walk away. But his insistence that they question their beliefs was so discomforting, so exasperating, that they put Socrates on trial, condemned him to death, and made him drink poison. He wasn't the last. 800 years later, in the ancient city of Alexandria, lived the philosopher Hypatia. She was a master astronomer, the leader of a philosophical school, and one of the first recognized female mathematicians in history. But she was also a pagan and a free thinker at a time when Christianity was spreading rapidly. Hypatia never forced anyone to give up their religion. Not a word she said could make anyone's beliefs any more or less true. It didn't matter. Finally, fed up with an influential thinker who rejected their faith, an enraged mob seized her in the street and killed her. She wasn't the last. 1200 years later, the friar and astronomer Giordano Bruno shocked Rome with his radical beliefs about space and time. Not only did Bruno believe that Earth went around the sun, he declared that the sun was just another star in an infinite universe teeming with intelligent life. Of course, nothing Bruno wrote, no matter how persuasive, could change the actual shape of the universe. It didn't matter, for his heresies, he was burned at the stake. As he was led to execution, a wooden vice was tightened around his mouth to shut him up. That last detail tells us something important. Socrates and Hypatia and Giordano Bruno had nothing but words, but some words, to some people, are so uncomfortable that they have to be silenced by any means necessary. What if I'm living my life wrong? What if my faith isn't true? What if we aren't the center of the universe? The deepest questions can also provoke the deepest discomfort, the deepest fear, the deepest rage. That often means they're working. If philosophy doesn't make you uncomfortable sometimes, it's not doing its job. When we take a hard, honest look in the mirror, it's natural to be disturbed. When we discover things we don't like about ourselves, small ways we've been lying to ourselves, bad habits we've fallen into, it's natural to be angry. Today, we don't burn people at the stake for asking uncomfortable questions. Usually, we ignore them. Sometimes we ridicule them. But the impulse to run away from the hard questions hasn't really changed. We have to learn to replace that impulse with a new one. Just as we can train ourselves to endure and even to seek the pain that sometimes comes from physical exercise, we can train ourselves to endure and to welcome the discomfort and fear that come when we do philosophy. Those feelings of discomfort are often proof that we're making progress. Philosophy demands clear thinking, and a quest for clarity often leads to consistency. But if philosophy addresses real life, it will also address life's contradictions. Consistency, like cleanliness, is usually good. But just as you can become obsessive-compulsive about cleanliness, you can become hypervigilant about consistency. Some of the thinkers we most remember weren't afraid of inconsistency, because they were daring enough to face up to the mess of real life. And many of the thinkers we forget made careers out of pointing out these inconsistencies. Poets like Walt Whitman got this. He wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." When we were in buds, I gave you a copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. Emerson had the same idea: speak what you think today in words as hard as cannonballs, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradicts everything you said today. Life isn't neat, life isn't tidy. And philosophy needs to speak to life. Philosophy is not, for me, a discipline about writing clever papers. It's a discipline about living well. The philosopher shouldn't offer a way of thinking, but a way of living. Socrates spent his life in conversation, and served in his city's army in wartime, but he never wrote a word. Cato, the Stoic Roman who resisted Julius Caesar, was considered one of the greatest philosophers of his time because he died for his beliefs, but he never wrote a word either. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was called a philosopher because he radiated wisdom and dignity, even though he wrote philosophy only in secret, in his private diary. These philosophers lived in the real world, Walker. They thought about life as it was lived in their time. Here's one of the thoughts Marcus Aurelius put down in his diary. Do you get angry with someone for smelling like an old goat? Or for having foul breath? What's the use? This is the most powerful man in the world and the wisest philosopher of his day writing to himself about armpit stink. I point this out not to belittle what he did or thought, but to show that he was willing to live in the muck with the rest of us. There is value in rigorously testing the logic underlying our thinking. But the difference between a philosophy fixated on the consistent use of words and philosophy that speaks to life is akin to the difference between dissecting a horse and riding one. We'll measure the worth of our words by how they move us to live well. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time, and still retain the ability to function. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Any serious person who digs into his or her mind will find a certain level of contradiction among strongly held thoughts and feelings, because those thoughts and feelings emerge in response to an imperfect world. A lot of superficial critics will take those moments of contradiction and pounce, but before you said, you have to brush those critics off. If you think deeply and you find that two important ideas seem to be in contradiction, what you should do first is celebrate. Your discovery is evidence that you've had the courage to think deeply. You've become self-aware. You've discovered something about yourself that most people never have the courage to consider, that your own ideas, and your own life, might not fit into a tidy little package. What do you do next? Press on. Maybe, as you think harder and live more, your contradiction will resolve itself. Maybe it won't. Remember that the intention of philosophy isn't to help you live a logical life. It's to make you self-aware and help you live a good life. Use logic, of course. But use it, don't serve it. Logic is a tool, not a master. The mysteries of life are such that it's unlikely that any set of propositions, no matter how rigorous, how structured, how measured, will ever be able to account for some of the most important things in our lives. Take beauty, for example. What would it be to live without moments of beauty? In a similar way, Walker, if we're going to think well about our lives, we have to remember that some things can be true most of the time without being true all of the time. Here's a well-known saying from a Supreme Court justice: hard cases make bad law. Extraordinary cases and extreme examples naturally pique our interest and invite our attention. And sometimes there's something to be learned about life in general when we look at a famous case in particular. But it's a mistake to root our thinking about rules for living in extreme example. The tallest person in the world is over 8 feet tall. That's fine to know, but we shouldn't expect it to guide the way houses and beds are built for the rest of us. This is obvious. But it needs to be mentioned because as soon as you name a rule you think ought to guide conduct in general, like, people who have strength should use that strength to protect people in need of protection, someone will say, and you told me you've really had to argue with people like this, but what if there's a wolf attacking a man, and you've got a gun and you can protect the man? But the man is a child molester and a dictator who has tortured millions of people and, if the wolf doesn't kill him, he'll escape back to his country and starve his people. Should you protect him then? In that case your responsibility is pretty clear, use the gun to finish what the wolf leaves undone. This is obviously stupid, silly, and fantastic. What is real, though, is the tendency to give up on the search for principles that can guide our lives most of the time just because they fail to apply all of the time. Fixating on extremes, like fixating on inconsistencies, can start to stand in the way of living well. To recognize that good thinking involves confronting our own inconsistencies does not excuse us from doing serious thinking. A serious philosophy doesn't have to be boring or complex. It can be engaging and straightforward. And to be guided by a serious philosophy means only that there is a relationship between thinking and action, in that order. Too often, we dive into action and, in retrospect, discover that we should have thought first. Afterward, we try to explain ourselves to ourselves, but our thinking is more an exercise in justification than a search for insight. We all do this. And there is no point in whipping ourselves for past failures to think. The danger, though, is that the explanation that justifies our past will become that philosophy that guides our future. You've seen this 100 times. And if you're like me, you've done it at least a few dozen times, well, okay, a few hundred. You do something stupid. Then you justify it. Then you start to believe your own justification. Then you start doing things to justify your justification. Remember Baba, the Lithuanian Special Forces commando in our Buds class? As he was fond of say, this shit has to end. Now. Zach, chances are good that, wherever you are right now, you're reading these words silently. In the ancient world, it was rare to find anyone who read silently. When words were read, they were usually read aloud, and often they were read to and with other people. That was true of philosophy as well. It wasn't something you studied on your own, it was something you read out loud with others. Philosophy was a shared discipline, part of a shared effort to live well. Plato wrote his philosophy in the form of dialogues, conversations. In his time, it's possible that they were performed aloud, like plays. Part of the message was that to live philosophically, you have to take turns listening and speaking, you have to look for truth with others. Aristotle spent his time not as a solitary writer, but as a teacher living in a community of scholars and students. When you go to a bookstore and see a volume of Aristotle's Nanomachine Ethics, you're actually looking at a collection of his lecture notes. And when he taught ethics, he reminded his students that the end of this science is not knowledge but action. In Plato and Aristotle's world, traveling philosophers, like traveling preachers more recently, often drew huge, excited crowds to their talks. And in great cities like Athens, philosophy students lived together, ate together, studied together, talked together. Philosophy was something people did together. You talked, you listened, you argued, you agreed. You tried to see things from your friend's point of view. You tried to live up to your teacher's example. You pushed your friends when their efforts slackened, and they pushed you. America's founders understood philosophy in the same way. George Washington, as I mentioned a few letters ago, put on a play about the fall of the Roman Republic for his troops at Valley Forge. Benjamin Franklin, when he was just 21, organized a club of friends called the Junto that met every week to discuss philosophy and public affairs. We still have a list of questions Franklin wrote to drive the discussions. Have you lately heard of any citizens thriving well, and by what means? Have you lately observed any encroachment on the just liberties of the people? Do you know of any fellow citizen who has lately done a worthy action, deserving praise and imitation? Or who has committed an error proper for us to be warned against and avoid? If you want to live like a philosopher, do what Franklin did, seek out good conversation. Philosophy is, and has always been, a kind of conversation. It's only by engaging with others that we break out of the prison of our own prejudices, our own bad habits, our own fears. That's what we're trying to do together here. If we recognize that our experience is limited, we should also recognize that our wisdom is limited. There is something about soldiering, about living through a brush with death and being responsible for the lives of others, that the non-soldier will never fully understand. There is something about starting and running a small business, about taking risks and being personally responsible for someone else's livelihood, that those who have never run a business will never quite grasp. There is something about being a parent, about love for a child, that a non-parent may never know. There is a certain kind of wisdom available to the soldier, the entrepreneur, the parent, and to people to 100 other walks of life that you can't know unless you actually live those lives. If we understand this, and if we also reflect on how minuscule our drop of experience is in the vast ocean of human experience, we should stand open to the wisdom that others have to offer. Philosophy is made to be practiced with others, because we all have a lot to learn from each other. Zach, you've got your third kid on the way. I couldn't be happier for you. I'm also grateful that we live in a world where we can look forward to childbirth with joy and not fear. 3,000 years ago, people celebrated the joy of a newborn child. But much more frequently than today, they also mourned the death of a stillborn child or a young woman who died giving birth. 3,000 years ago, people rejoiced when their warriors came home from battle. Much more frequently than today, they grieved when they heard the news that those they loved would never come home. 3,000 years ago, people gave thanks for the turning of the seasons with feasts and festivals. Much more frequently than today, they suffered famine, disaster, and disease. To deal with this agony, they developed philosophies, the ideas and practices that built resilience into their lives. Epictetus, a slave and a philosopher, lived in this ancient world of insecurity and uncertainty. Every time you kiss your child goodnight, he said, you should tell yourself, perhaps it will be dead in the morning. The suggestion that you think of your child's imminent death every night seems alien and cruel to us. But in the ancient Roman world, more than a quarter of newborns died before their first birthday, and half of all children died before their 10th. Epictetus was not being needlessly harsh. Instead, he was reminding parents to be grateful for what they had in that moment, and to mentally prepare themselves for a hardship they might face any day. Today, we're remarkably fortunate. We still worry about the death of an infant. How many times did you get up at night to check Shane's breathing in his first month at home? But a young child's death is a tragedy far fewer of us have to face. Before I joined the military, I'd seen the human suffering of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda. I'd seen children in Cambodia who were missing limbs taken by land mines. I saw the dead eyes of abandoned and drug-addicted kids on the streets of Bolivia. I have seen, as you have, blood spilled in battle. There is still real hardship in our world, and we've both seen it. But we live in a world marked by great progress. Food is more plentiful, disease rarer, early death less common, knowledge more accessible, people freer than at any time in history. Human beings exert a mastery over the physical world, traveling thousands of miles in several hours rather than several months, controlling air temperature with the twist of a dial, sharing ideas instantaneously across oceans, that would have seemed godlike to a person of Aeschylus's time. But many of us lucky enough to take part in this ease and freedom have also lost touch with the wisdom about resilience built by men and women who lived in a harder world. In our security and comfort, we slip quietly into the false expectation that life will afford us complete happiness. We believe that we will move only from pleasure to pleasure, from joy to joy. When tragedy strikes, our hardship hits, too many of us feel ambushed by pain, betrayed by the present, despairing of the future. Do you remember when we were in the first phase classroom days after September 11, 2001, and the instructors were briefing us on the Taliban? They told us that the Taliban moved fast and light. Few supplies. Simple clothes. Rifle, ammo, minimal food. They sometimes walked in sandals made of rubber cut from tires. They were painting a picture of a rugged, mobile, lethal force. One day you stood up in the middle of class and said something like, "Let's go. I'll wear tire shoes. I'll walk in the cold. I'll go light. I'm ready to fight." It was a great Walker moment. So let me use it to draw an analogy. For most of history, our feet were hardened by walking on the rough ground. In our world, most people wear shoes. Shoes are good. They protect our feet. But we realized it is possible to gain something very good and still lose something very real. What most of us have lost is the ability to walk barefoot over difficult ground. Today, sheltered from the hardships of hunger, disease, heat, and cold that stalked human life for centuries, some people have lost their capacity to deal with real difficulty. Growing up in a protected palace of comfort, they have lost their ability to walk through pain. Zach, the other day, you wrote to me about growing up in the woods.
About 6 months before I was born, my folks traded a 1953 Willys pickup truck and $500 for that single wide I would call home for the first 9 years of my life. One day in winter, they hauled it up the skid trail, which would then become our driveway. I remember Dad cutting in water bars with the dozer every winter to keep it from falling off the mountain. The ranch was covered in Douglas firs and towering redwoods. A creek ran right through the middle of it and went a quarter mile down the driveway to spill into Austin Creek. My closest neighbor was a mile away. My folks had about a quarter-acre garden with an 8-foot fence protecting the crops from deer and other wildlife. We had chickens and hogs and a couple of cows for butchering when the work got slim in the winter. My dad was a backhoe operator and mixer driver down at the end of the canyon where one of the town's 3 businesses was, a rock quarry and concrete plant. The other 2 businesses were a lumber mill and a logging and excavation outfit on the other side of the ranch. One of his coworkers told me one time when I was about 20 years old, "I like your dad. He hates me, but the thing about your old man is that he hates everyone the same."
I've known you for more than a decade now, and I think growing up in the sticks has shaped the way you think, maybe more than you know. People who grow up like you did have a real connection to the earth. They grow up understanding that life has a reality, sun, moon, heat, frost, flood, drought, that is beyond human control, a reality we must accept, adjust to, and work with. When you were logging, each day was shaped by the burn of the sun, the speed of the wind, the snap of the cold. When the outdoors is a part of your life, it's hard not to be a realist. But when people spend all of their time in a world shaped by human hands, they bring a different perspective to their lives. Those who grow up in or near cities often see the world as built by and for other people, and they tend to believe that if we continue to build it better, we can achieve perfection. Without openly acknowledging it, they often believe that the relentless pursuit of progress will eventually lead us to paradise. A clue: ask them if there are any unsolvable problems. If they can't think of problems that won't ever be solved, they are most likely utopians, even if they aren't self-aware enough to see it. I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but this is a big idea with big consequences. The French Revolution was led mostly by urban-raised idealists who believed in the perfectibility of man. The American Revolution was led mostly by agrarian-raised realists who understood the imperfectibility of man. The French Revolution led to a reign of terror and to dictatorship, as waves of utopians sought to kill anyone who stood in the way of the perfectly rational society. The American Revolution ultimately led to a constitution that divided power and set men against each other, lest any one person's failures destroy the entire country. The French Revolution produced men like Maximilien Robespierre, who said things like this: "By sealing our work with our blood, we may see at last the bright dawn of universal happiness." The American Revolution produced men like James Madison, who said things like this: "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This policy of supplying, by opposite and rival interests, the defect of better motives, might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public." I don't want to suggest that how you're raised or where you grow up seals the shape of your thinking for the rest of your life. In fact, there are many counterexamples to what I've just suggested. I do want to insist that realism, about the world we find ourselves in, about the imperfect communities we build, about our own natures, matters for resilience. Resilient realists know that life, despite our highest ideals, is imperfect. You learned as a logger that you can't control the weather, and that the weather has real consequences for your work. You've learned, too, that you can't control the greed of others, and that greed has real consequences for your community. Human failings, like a gathering thunderstorm in the woods, are more dangerous if we close our eyes to them until it's too late. Resilience is not a path to perfection. Instead, we seek to be resilient in the face of life's imperfect reality. The political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli wrote, "The Romans saw when troubles were coming and always took countermeasures. They never, to avoid a war, allowed them to go unchecked, because they knew that there is no avoiding war, it can only be postponed to the advantage of others." In the SEAL teams, an instructor once said that war is an acronym, we are ready. Readiness means confronting the reality that life's course is not completely under your control. Readiness is a form of humility, spurred by a recognition of how little we can know or control. Hardship is unavoidable. Resilient people recognize this reality. Then they prepare themselves for it, seeking to meet it as best they can, on their own terms. Realism also teaches us humility about our limited ability to change others. The monk Thomas à Kempis understood this human limitation: if you cannot make yourself what you would wish to be, how can you bend others to your will? Think about how hard it is to change your own behavior, to pull yourself out of a rut, to root out a bad habit. And all this difficulty comes when you try to change the single person over whom you have the most power, yourself. Reflect, then, on how much harder it is to change someone else. We can have a profound influence on others. That's true. And I want you to serve because the world needs what you have to offer. At the same time, the most successful service begins with the recognition that people will make their own choices. Imagine that human nature can be perfected, and the human failings all around you, others and your own, will infuriate you. You might even find yourself tempted to think, like Robespierre, that people must be bullied or terrorized into goodness. Recognize, as realists do, that life has a tragic character, that human beings are flawed, and that both the natural and the human world are beyond your power to control, and you'll have a better chance of serving effectively. There are different kinds of simplicity. Some are better than others. There is simplicity that comes from a lack of knowledge and experience. You told me that when you were a kid, you and your brother Ed were sitting on the porch one night and Ed asked your dad how all of the stars got up in the sky. You told him that God got up on a ladder and put them all there. That's a simple answer. Kids often have simple answers to explain the world. It's fun and sometimes beautiful. But if we live with a child's simplicity into adulthood, we often find ourselves ravaged by reality. Think about how our understanding of good and evil changes, grows deeper and often more painful, as we grow older. Alexander Solzhenitsyn knew about evil. He was a writer who chronicled the Soviet Gulag and served 8 years in its forced labor camps. He wrote, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them, but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" The more we think, the more we study, the more we learn, the more likely it is that we will confront some of life's complications. As we begin to know more, we grasp details. We see nuances. If we struggle with those details, nuances, and complications successfully, on the other side of them we achieve a different kind of simplicity. I'm sure you've noticed that, in almost any endeavor, people who really know their stuff can explain it clearly. The master instructor knows the details but coaches with simple instructions: stand tall, breathe, and so on. The master teacher understands every word of her text but concentrates on the central idea. The ability to explain complicated things with clarity is a mark of mastery. Unfortunately, it's sometimes those who have mastered the least who talk the most. When we practice philosophy, we strive to grow from the simplicity of the child to the clarity of the adult. Simplicity is easy. Clarity is earned. We earn clarity by confronting complexity. In philosophy, we have to think about what it means to be good. This sounds like the ultimate philosophical abstraction. What is the nature of the good? Or what counts as being good? But this also matters a lot to living a resilient life, and I'll explain why. Broadly speaking, you will be faced with two ways of thinking about what counts as good in life: intentions or results. When the genocide was happening in Rwanda in 1994, I remember that many people around the world were shocked and outraged. Many people wanted to help. I also remember that their wanting didn't matter. There was a great dividing line between all of the speeches, protests, feelings, empathy, good wishes, and words in the world, and the one thing that could stop the violence: protecting people through the use of force or the threat of force. In situations like this, good intentions and heartfelt wishes were not enough. The great dividing line between words and results was courageous action. One of the greatest gulfs in life is between sounding good and doing good. We are ultimately measured by our results, by the way our actions shape the world around us. Without results, all the kind intentions in the world are just a way of entertaining ourselves. It may be helpful to think about the difference between intentions and results by looking at how the Greeks thought about right action. The word that shows up again and again in their discussions of ethics is arete. As we've already discussed, arete doesn't really mean virtue, though that's how it's often translated. When the Greeks used the word arete, it referred to excellence. They used the same word to describe the excellence of a vase, the excellence of a great runner, and the excellence of a person. To be excellent is to be someone who produces excellence. There is no such thing as an excellent shoemaker who regularly turns out flimsy shoes. So think a bit about what the Greeks must have believed about having an excellent character. Your character was judged excellent not before you acted, but after. The judgment was based not on your intentions, but on your results. When we think of virtue as an excellence, we don't ask, "What did I intend?" We ask, "What did I do?" The morality of intentions, which would measure our goodness in terms of what we hope to accomplish rather than what we actually accomplish, tells us that our thoughts and feelings count for something in their own right. It's an appealing philosophy to those who exist, or want to exist, in a world of pure thought or feeling. But it can also be a selfish kind of morality. It elevates the helper above the one who should be helped. It says, what matters is the fact that I have the right opinions, not what good my opinions do in the world. What matters is what I hope or intend, not what you deserve or receive. In fact, a morality of intentions, even the best intentions, can distort your view of the world in a way that leads to great harm. Think of it this way. It's nice that someone might want to help a child to read. It's nice if they show up every day to do so. But it's wrong to go to those lessons unprepared and incapable of doing real good. It wastes that child's time and stands in the way of the help she really needs. From the perspective of intentions, that volunteer might have reason to pat himself on the back. But from the perspective of results, that volunteer is making an active contribution to a child's illiteracy. After the Rwandan genocide, the media flocked to stories of desperate war orphans, and aid agencies set up orphanages across the border in Zaire for refugee children separated from their parents. The problem was that many of the children taken into these group homes weren't orphans. I talked with mothers who gave up their children, temporarily, they hoped, because they thought it was the only way to ensure their children's survival. It was a vicious cycle. Money flowed into the centers to care for the growing number of children, and the increased resources led even more families to place their children in the centers. With little supervision, some children were abused, others were fostered out to work for unscrupulous people in the refugee camps. Sometimes these orphanages were moved back to Rwanda, and then children really were separated from their parents. The orphanages grew from the best intentions, but they often harmed the very children they were intended to serve. The aid agencies could have directed their funds toward supporting caregivers and keeping families intact wherever possible, but perversely, their actions help to break families apart. A morality of results doesn't demand that we succeed every time or else be judged bad people. It does tell us to put the well-being of others at the center of our judgments about right and wrong. Before I pronounce myself good, I have to point to something more than what I wanted to happen. I have to point to what I have done in the world. A morality of intentions also fails to help us get better. If all that matters are our intentions, we don't have much of a reason to make ourselves better at doing good. A morality of results is difficult precisely because it requires us to mold ourselves into wiser, tougher, more capable people who do good in a difficult world. Many people shaped by the morality of intentions find that their abilities atrophy. They talk more and more and do less and less. With each disappointment with the world, they retreat further into themselves, convinced ever more of their own righteousness and the world's wickedness. People content with good intentions rarely make a difference. It is hard to teach a 6-year-old to read. It is hard to help a homeless woman find a job and break the cycle of poverty. But people accomplish this hard work every day. The people who accomplish such things regularly and with excellence are the ones who hold themselves accountable for results. It's nice that you want to make a difference. But here's the hard truth: your wanting is irrelevant to the people who need your help. They don't need your wanting. They need your strength in action, and they need you to be open to discovering what actually works. Remember the first day of Buds? It started with a 4-mile run, in soft sand, at 0-500. If you finished in 32 minutes flat, you got to sit. If you finished at 32:01, you got hammered. The instructors made the guys who failed run in and out of the 50-some degree water of the Pacific again and again and again. They ran out of the ocean, dropped to the ground, and rolled on the beach until they were wet and sandy. I remember how the instructors circled around a man who'd failed the run and was now covered in salt water and sand. They were making him do push-ups, and he had his hands buried in the sand and his butt in the air. His arms were shaking, failing him. Drool hung from his lip as he tried to spit the sand out of his mouth. He must have said something like, "I'm trying," because the instructor exploded, "There is no try. We do not try. Your teammates do not need you to try to cover their backs. Your swim buddy does not need you to try to rescue him on a dive. Your platoon does not need you to try to shoot straight. There is no try. There is only do. Do, or do not. There is no try." The fact that the instructor stole this line from Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back didn't make it any less true, or any less what we all needed to hear. The lesson was this: if your best is not good enough, make your best better. If you tried hard and failed, then try harder, or find a new way to try until you succeed. Trying hard is trying hard. Success is success. There is a difference. Despite an overwhelming amount of well-intentioned nonsense that we now teach our children, it actually is not enough to try hard. Yes, it's good to try hard. It is even better to try hard and, after suffering numerous setbacks and working through hardship and pain and temporary defeat, to achieve, to master. Trying hard builds character, but it is only the achievement that follows the effort that builds true confidence. We teach children that it doesn't matter whether they win or lose, it's how they play the game. But this lesson can be taught poorly or well. Taught poorly, this lesson results in children who are careless of the outcome of their actions. Who are more concerned with double and triple checking their inner state than with measuring themselves against the world. Taught well, though, this lesson makes clear that while the valiant might lose many, many times, the object of the valiant is to persevere until victory. Intentions do matter. But they matter because they find expression in our actions and in our character. What ultimately matters is not what we intend, but who we become and what we leave behind us. Those who live by a morality of results and responsibility are much more likely to be resilient, because what matters most to them is useful work. Because their effectiveness matters to them, they take seriously the lessons the world teaches them, including the lessons of disappointment. Because they don't allow themselves to retreat into the purity of their intentions, they learn to confront the facts of failure. This allows them to grow in humility and in the honesty with which they see themselves. Certain ideas can be understood only when we contend with them in practice. The philosopher Martin Heidegger famously pointed out that you can't come to know a hammer by staring at it. You can't come to know a hammer by reading about one either. You have to use the hammer. When you do, you hit your thumb. You bend the nail double when you whack it at the wrong angle, and then you have to undo your mistake. In time, you come to understand the hammer's weight in your hand, and you recognize the feel when you hit a nail square. Only by using the hammer do you come to know it. Philosophy is meant to be done, not just studies. Only by using philosophy do you come to know it. It is a practice. It takes practice. So let's talk a bit about practice.